Shut up and sit down. Hey guys, I'm Sai and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation, where you can find podcasts, interviews and content on a variety of subjects. We have series on football, mental health, serial killers, films, TV, conspiracy theories, wrestling, music and more. Today's guest, formerly of Fightful.com, now working for The Score, is one of the top MMA journalists in the world, in my opinion. And I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, MMA journalist and senior news editor for The Score, Mr. James Lynch. Welcome, James. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. And just want to clarify, I'm not a serial killer, just to separate myself from the rest of the topics here. But glad to be here, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's cool. Then we got a wide variety of series going on. I seem to spend my life at the moment recording with different people on different subjects, but some of them merge together nicely, so it's all right. But they're not the serial killer one. That tends to be separate from everything.
That's good. Yeah, it's good to have variety.
So before we sort of talk into your career and some mixed martial arts, I was hoping you could tell us a bit about how you got to where you are now, sort of starting with your childhood, where you grew up.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'll give you, I mean, we could be here for a while if we want to go into every detail, but basically, I'm from Canada, actually from Vancouver, born and raised there. Always had an interest in sports, played a lot of different sports growing up, hockey, rugby, soccer. Yeah, I mean, just anything like a normal Canadian kid would. And somewhere along in high school, I wanted to become a sports broadcaster. I really enjoyed sports, used to watch it a lot, especially hockey. Hockey was sort of my number one sport, which, again, playing into the stereotypical Canadian of liking hockey and all that stuff. And so I went to university for communications. And then along the way, I remember just, I think my second year of university, I just remember seeing The Ultimate Fighter and the first season, and I was like hooked. I don't know what it was about the show, but I remember the episode. It was the one where Chris Liebman got really drunk and he ends up trying to get away from Bobby Southworth. And he ends up going and like busting the door down to try and look for Bobby Southworth. That was like one of the most memorable episodes. And I don't know what it was, but for some reason I was really hooked on that show. So I immediately became a fan and started watching the UFC. And then I started watching Pride and sort of everything else that came through it. And I was always a fan, but the goal, once I was in university was to go into hockey. And then I ended up getting an internship at a sports network and ended up doing some script writing there. And then from there, I went to work at the Fight Network in Toronto. So I was going to university in Ottawa, which is like out east compared to Vancouver. Wanted to get out of Vancouver just to try something different, expand my horizons. And I ended up in Toronto a few years later and ended up doing an internship. And then, like I said, went to Fight Network. And that's where like my fandom for combat sports was like amplified like times 12 because the Fight Network, back when I was there, they were covering MMA and they were covering boxing and they were covering all these sports. So I really got to hone my skills there. And it was also there that I really learned how to edit video, which would come into play later, which I'll get to in a second. But and then from there, I was at Fight Network for about 4 years, close to 4 years. Ended up working at TSN, which is like the Canadian ESPN. And then from there, I was just working like a regular day job, then at Discovery Channel. Then I worked for another digital company as well. And then once I had left sort of the full-time sports sphere at Fight Network, and I was doing sort of these other jobs, MMA was sort of a side gig to me. So, let's go to like maybe 2011, 2012. I was freelancing for a couple different sites, just doing some writing and just wanting to keep that, interest in MMA going. And then, maybe around 2013, 2014, that's where I started working for MMA Oddsbreaker and I started doing my podcast. And that's sort of where my interviews came into play. And I remember doing the audio podcast, and this was the time, even still, where I think a lot of people are doing just mainly audio podcasts. And, it was going well, and I was getting some decent guests, but I got tired of transcribing interviews, and I was like, I've always wanted to be a broadcaster. Like, why not just, do this on camera? So I learned how to record video on Skype like we're doing right here, and I just decided to start doing video interviews, and they ended up going quite well. And I was able to kind of get my personality in there, and it's just for the fighters, it was better for them as well, just because they're getting on camera exposure as opposed to just being on someone's like audio podcast. And my philosophy early on, which ended up paying off for me, was I'll interview anyone. I think a lot of times you'll see people just mainly cover the UFC. I was covering regional MMA specifically and doing UFC and Bellator interviews as well. But it was those early relationships I had with regional fighters that really paid off, because a lot of the fighters that I've interviewed, years ago are now in the UFC. And they have that relationship with me, dating back years ago. So it basically, I was doing that on the side, working a day job, all that stuff. And then basically when I became a dad in October of 2017, I had to make a choice. I couldn't do both. I couldn't just, freelance MMA and have a day job. So I quit the day job calculatedly, like I was calculated about it. I didn't just quit and, hope for the best. I had got on with a couple different outlets at the time. So back when I was working a full-time job, I was just working for MMA Oddsbreaker and Flow Combat. Once I decided to, make the foray into full-time, I believe at the time I was working for Fightful, was one of the first ones, which, great fit. And they, had me do my video interviews over there. Then I worked for Fansided, and then I worked for MMA Mania as well, doing some video editing. So basically, I was working for a bunch of different websites just to make it so I could do this full time, because obviously I have bills to pay and everything else. And it was great. And I did that right up until, a couple outlets switched, like, Fanside. I left Fansided at a certain point and went to SureDog. And then, some other sites came into play. I started writing for BJ Penn. I started doing video interviews for MMA News and all this stuff. And then eventually it led to, this past May, I guess, where the Score, which is a huge, digital sports media outlet. It's not a television network, but it's a big outlet that covers all types of sports. Came to me and said, "Hey, we want someone to run our MMA department," and here we are today. So I kind of gave a long answer, but I think I kind of answered the question to a certain degree.
Yeah.
How I went from point A to point B.
No, that's cool. That's cool. I think one of the things I wanted to pick up on you straight away. Obviously, I'm a Welshman, and they play rugby in. Do they play rugby in Canada, like in the schools?
They do.
And
Actually,
stuff
rugby's pretty popular. So I went to a boarding school, and it was mandatory to play rugby. My 8th to 12th, I think it was 8 to 10. You had to play rugby. And honestly, if I had the choice of playing it or not playing it when I was in the 8th grade, I absolutely would have done something else. But I'm glad I did, because one of the ththings that rugby really emphasizes is teamwork. You have to be in a unit, when you're doing a scrum or anything. And so I'm really glad that I was able to do it. But it was very, very beneficial for me when I was playing sports.
Yeah, that's really cool, because like sometimes when I speak to people from like America or Canada, and you'll say rugby, and they'll look at you as if you've said like something they've never heard of. So that's really cool. But obviously, Canada have got a rugby team who are half decent as well. So, are you interested in any other sports in terms of, like, not necessarily to cover, but like just as a fan?
Yeah, I think hockey's like my number one. I'd actually at some point would like to get back into covering hockey. I've never actually had a chance to do that. With the Score, there might be some possibilities, because they do have credentials for other sports. So that's something maybe down the line I'll do. But right now, we're about a month into the new job with the MMA section, so just want to make sure that's all smoothed out first. But I love hockey. That's like my number two. And then I follow all other sports like pretty casually. Like I watched the NBA finals, obviously, and the Raptors this entire playoff run. I used to live in Toronto, so I live in Vancouver now. But I spent 10 years in Toronto, so following the Raptors to them winning the NBA title was pretty cool. And I sort of keep an eye on what's going on. NFL, same thing. I kind of keep an eye on what's happening there. Boxing, I watch a little bit of boxing here and there as well too. But those are sort of the main ones. And then baseball, like very little, but I still sort of keep tabs in it. But yeah, I mean, I'm a subscriber to The Athletic. Which is, in the U.S. is a, pretty big sports outlet where all sort of the major writers go. So I'm always reading up on every sport. And I mean, I'd say, but as far as like dedicating time, it's definitely hockey and MMA for sure.
Cool. So would you say, in terms of, like you get some boxing fans and some MMA fans who are like one or the other, and they're very traditional and they don't like the other side, are you sort of more towards the MMA side in terms of what you'd rather watch?
Yeah, I would. I think with MMA, I think Joe Rogan said it best. Boxing is a limited form of fighting. I mean, you can only punch. That's it. Not to discredit anything away from the sport, because there's certainly a science to it. That's why they call it the sweet science. But yeah, I mean, MMA. If I had my preference, I'd rather watch MMA than boxing. Now, saying that, like if I had the choice between watching like Wild Bill's Fight Night and like Fury Wilder, obviously I'm going to watch Fury Wilder. But it really just depends on the fight. I think like we had Tyson Fury fight this past Friday. Like I had to watch Bellator instead. So I mean, I caught that after. So I mean, you do have to sort of pick and choose. But if there's a weekend where there's a big boxing fight and maybe the UFC is not as strong, I'll probably watch that. So I'd say it just depends on the event.
Yeah, and I think it makes a difference, a big difference, doesn't it? Like, obviously, if you're not covering it, is like who's fighting. Like Tyson Fury is just an all-round entertaining guy, isn't he? He's just got a bit of everything, and he's got the skills to back it up as well.
He does, and I'm going to just look this up quickly, but Tyson Fury actually was someone that when I worked at Fight Network, we interviewed like ages ago because he fought in Canada against a guy. What the heck was the guy's name? I'm just going to look it up here. Yeah, he fought a I believe it was a Canadian, years ago, and just it's weird to see him the star he is now, because I remember seeing him ages ago when he was young, and now here he is like one of boxing's biggest stars. I didn't do a ton of boxing stuff, but I certainly remember hearing his name, like, we're talking like 10 years ago, and now here he is like this mega star. So it's been cool to see. And I feel like right now, I was having this discussion with someone else. I feel like right now boxing is in a pretty good spot. You've got all these different outlets like, DAZN, and, really putting on high quality shows. And I feel like you're seeing more names now in boxing than say a couple of years ago. I remember when it was the Klitschko brothers, there wasn't a lot of buzz with boxing, but now you've got Wilder and Fury, and we just had Anthony Joshua lose to Ruiz. So there's a lot of fun stuff happening right now in boxing, and I think it's great for everyone. I like to see as much combat sports exposure as possible.
Yeah, certainly an interesting period for boxing, because obviously previous to Joshua losing, you had the three of them all wanting seemingly to fight each other. And it seemed to be gearing up for a couple of mega fights. Obviously, Joshua losing just adds a little bit of sort of mystique to where they may go. And, Tyson Fury never lost his titles, and he seems to be, physically and mentally very fit. So it's looking good. And like you say, the more big fights and big characters for combat sports overall, the better. I feel like the more people like Conor McGregor at his peak, and even Chael Sonnen, he obviously had his issues with failed drug tests and things like that, and he never quite won the big fight in terms of a title. But in terms of promoting a fight, there's not many as capable as him.
Yeah, no, it's true. And that's what you like to see. I mean, if I hear like my dad, I always use my dad as sort of the gauge of like how popular some fighter is. Like my dad knows Conor McGregor, my dad knows Chael Sonnen. So I think it's good if you're having, notable names like this, just to bring more attention to combat sports. Because I know boxing, it has a rich history. I mean, there's certainly people that have, all over the world that follow boxing, not just in North America. But you would hope that MMA gets to that point where, you have these sort of household names where people are talking about it at the water cooler on a Monday or something, right? So, I think like you said, the more stars that they can produce in both sports, I think is great for everyone.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting actually. I was having a conversation the other day with someone about the streaming services. Obviously, DAZN is spending mega money on boxing, MMA, and other sorts of things. And obviously, then you've got this huge ESPN deal, which was the streaming deal was big enough, and then obviously they've gone to the exclusive pay-per-view deal where you can only get your pay-per-views through them. Do you think that the ESPN deal specifically is going to harm the pay-per-view buys for the UFC, or do you think that they don't really care because they're getting their money up front anyway?
I don't think the UFC cares. I think they just want to put it. I mean, to me, this seems like more of a beneficial move for the UFC and the owners than it is for the fighters. They want to basically monopolize everything by having everything going through ESPN. Now, in Canada, I should point out that this doesn't affect us whatsoever. We can still go and buy a UFC pay-per-view the traditional way because we actually don't get ESPN Plus in Canada. Everything airs on TSN. So for me, it doesn't really impact me, but I know I've heard from Americans how disappointed they are that, if someone's like, if you have like a dad or something that doesn't know how to use technology and he has to order it through the app, I could see there being issues there, but I don't know if there's been any sort of ripple effect from that. We'd have to sort of see more data, but yeah, I think like if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably more beneficial for the owners than the fighters themselves.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is as well is if you live, somewhere in America which is quite isolated, and maybe the internet connection's not that quick. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You can't order it through the TV anymore at all, can you? In America, you have to.
I don't believe so. Yeah, I believe it's through the app.
Plus.
Yeah.
So if you've got if you live somewhere quite isolated and you want to watch the fight, you can't just phone up and get, the pay-per-view. You're going to struggle. And like you say, people, older men, women, or whoever, who are not really into that technology, if they've got to do a lot of faffing about and signing up to this and signing up to that just to order it, I feel like you may lose some viewers who will just think, oh, I'll watch the boxing on HBO or whatever channel. So it's certainly an interesting landscape with the streaming.
Not just
I
that,
can't.
but sorry to interrupt you, but I mean bars as well. Like if you go to a sports bar, like how easy is that for the sports bar to get ESPN Plus and put it on there? Most of them don't have like a smart TV, or they don't have the box to order a pay-per-view. So I've been hearing as well that that's another thing that's been impacting, because a lot of people don't want to pay for the pay-per-view. They'll go to a sports bar. Some sports bars won't carry it because they just don't have the capabilities of getting the app and having it stream across the bar.
Yeah, I didn't think of that at all. Of course, because like if you go, I'm assuming it's similar in America and Canada that it is to Britain. Most pubs or bars have got, they've got flat screen TV or whatever, but they're they're not like the latest TV, or there's just a TV for big enough for people to watch, and they're not necessarily, like you say, smart TVs, which then it means you can't order. But excuse me, sorry. So this it's an interesting twist, and I think I've got to be honest. I think that's why Brock Lesnar's now retired, because he didn't have the leverage of the sort of the pay-per-view buys, because they didn't need to. I feel like obviously I've got no inside information whatsoever, but I feel like his leverage dissipated with this deal, where they weren't reliant on the pay-per-view buys from the fight.
I'd agree with that. I actually sort of have the same idea, and it might also be the same reason that we haven't seen Conor McGregor rush back, and take a fight, because he hasn't. McGregor hasn't fought since this new policy came in. I'm not saying he won't ever fight again, but I'd certainly add some roadblocks, because, like you said, there was a percentage of the pay-per-views. I don't know how that trickles down to the fighters now, like I said. So but I wonder if that's part of it as well, because Brock at this point, he's so old. I mean, he's really got to look out for the financial side of things. If he does make a comeback, because if you're fighting Daniel Cormier, that's not an easy fight, right? So
no, he wants to get his money. Absolutely. So you mentioned obviously that you got into sort of video editing, and I saw I had a little peek at your LinkedIn page earlier, and it mentioned about you got a decent skill set in sort of graphics and stuff. Did you teach yourself those aspects, or did you do those in university?
So I learned a little bit of editing in university. I was actually trained on Final Cut, and then when I worked at Fight Network, that's when I learned Adobe Premiere. And man, that of anything that I've ever done, I'd say that's one of the most beneficial things, because I edit all my stuff in Adobe Premiere. I'm very familiar with the Adobe products. I know how to use Photoshop and After Effects and things like that. So for me, I kind of left that part out of when I was talking about what I was doing. But I mean, I see a lot of people wanting to do video interviews, but they have no idea how to do production. Whereas me, I was lucky where I knew how to create like good templates and have really, solid video like coming out, and I understand video formats and things like that. So I've really, not only was I able to, produce get good guests or get good interviews, but I also had the presentation look good. I mean, a lot of times I see people, posting video content, but the presentation's not great, the sound's not great, the graphics don't look good. So that's one advantage I had as well that I think helped me, get to where I got to today, because like none of my stuff looks, clunky. It looks, fairly clean if you look at, the presentation. And I've actually done videos on this on my YouTube channel, which I don't really update anymore since I've been at the Score. But I'm happy to share the wealth, because I find that that's a lot of roadblock. That's a big roadblock for a lot of people, is the editing side of it. But I would imagine now, I mean, even for After Effects, a lot of that I had to learn on YouTube. But Premiere, I sort of learned back in the day, and I've sort of been picking up tricks as I go along. But it's a good asset to have. If you're in media, learning video editing is a very good skill to have.
Sorry. Funny enough, my next question was, what software do you use? Because obviously I'm about this is number 35, I think, episode. And I'm pretty decent with IT generally, but sort of video editing and graphics and stuff was completely out of my wheelhouse and quite new. And the first couple of episodes, the I think the very first episode I did, I used Hangouts at a laptop, and the camera wasn't very good, and you could see with my sort of graphics for the names and stuff and the overlay weren't that great. But I feel like I've got a bit of a handle on it now, and I've got to the point now where I feel like the software that I'm using is not quite as good as where I want it to be, if you get what I mean. I've sort of overtaken. So yeah, I use Film Nora at the moment, which
Okay.
is fine and is decent enough. It does everything I need it to do, but I am looking into different software to use. So which one? You said Adobe Premiere.
I use Adobe
Is
Premiere, yeah, and I use a PC. I should mention that as well. I've always been a PC guy. I have a Mac as well, which I need to I use for like sometimes what'll happen is when I book an interview, some fighters don't want to set up Skype, which is where I record all my interviews. So I'll actually just if they have an iPhone, I'll just do the interview over FaceTime, because on a Mac you can record a FaceTime video, and then usually what I'll do is I'll take that video and bring it back over to the PC side and edit it over there. So yeah, I to me it's I kind of have I'll kind of keep this simple if I can. So I record using because I find the best quality when it comes to recording video interviews is for like recording my end of things. I use just the default Windows camera that's on there. You get really high quality video. I find with like the built-in Skype recorder and with a Vair, you don't get as good a quality. So I record myself, then I record my audio on my end under Audacity, and then I record the other person's end using a Vair. And a Vair's hit or miss, but the problem with the Vair is, the reason I keep using a Vair is because the quality is just better than anything out there that I've seen anyway. So what I do is when I record, it only records the other person's end of the conversation, and then my end I'm recording locally. And then basically I get these two files, I put them together in Premiere, and then that's how I get my interview. I know it sounds complicated, but I'm so used to it now that it's not that bad. Like it's pretty good, and I find it gets the best quality stuff out of anything I've done.
Okay, I'm gonna have. I think I'll have a nose at some YouTube videos later.
Yeah, and hit me up after this too. I'm more than happy to answer. I get questions all the time about video recording, and so like I said, I have a couple tutorials on my channel because I was getting those questions all the time, and I was just like, look, I'll just make a video. It's a lot easier to do. So I threw that on there, and it's sort of like sort of an easy way to figure out how I record stuff, and everyone has sort of their own method. I know other people do. They'll use like OBS or whatever, and they'll record like live on YouTube. That's a good solution. But for me, like I do those fighter pick videos, so I like to record locally. That way I can do stuff that doesn't necessarily have to make it in the interview, and I can use that content for later. So I prefer to record like locally as opposed to recording live like some people will do. So everyone's got their own methods as well. And one other thing I'll mention is just on my channel as well, I also have like tips and tricks. Like I'll put out like I have a video like top 5 tips I would give anyone covering MMA, because there is really nothing out there like that. And I would get questions like, how'd you get into MMA? What would you recommend doing? And I literally just outline it in 5 points. And I just say like, look, like this is what I would recommend you do. I'm not an expert, but these are things that help me along the way. Because there's not really like there's the MMA JA, and things like that. But I find if you want to know how to make it in this industry, there's not really a lot of help out in that regard. So I'm happy to do my part on that.
Yeah, cool. I think I'll be going down a rabbit hole of your YouTube videos later on. Then, by the sounds of it, but yeah, it's something which I'm looking to expand a bit now. Like I don't do my shows live because I prefer to record them and then edit in things like the overlay and the name tags and the.
It's way easier to do it that way. Like if you record something live and something screws up, there's a bad connection, like to try and edit that on YouTube is a nightmare. I actually had an issue the other day where I had to take something out of a video, and rather than just try and edit it on YouTube and wait for it to finish rendering, I just was like, I'm just going to upload a new copy. It's way faster to do it that way. So yeah, I think it's way better. I would recommend anyone watching this, if you're looking to do video interviews, record it locally if you can, because then that way, like I've had really bad connection issues sometimes, and through the power of editing, people don't even notice because I was just able to go through and actually clean it up. So that's a little tip.
Cool. Yeah, I might look into that, because obviously I tend to just record them within Skype, and then I used Hangouts a couple of times, but I found that as soon as someone joined the conversation, the camera quality really suffered.
Yeah,
whereas on Skype, I find that Skype holds the camera quality a lot better, and generally the connection is very stable. So it's not
And,
very
and if you're
often
and
that
if
you
you're gonna
get
do
written
like
out.
something long, like I do a podcast every Monday and Wednesday. I do that on Hangouts because that's so long. Like I wouldn't want to record that locally to Skype. Like I'm losing some quality, but the convenience of not having to upload an hour-long video is just
Yeah, of
like
course.
it just makes more sense. So I would say to anyone looking to do any shorter interviews, like anything between 10 to 20 minutes, even 30 minutes, I'd still do it locally instead of Hangouts. So
Cool. Right. So obviously before you went to the score, you were working you were freelancing, and you did some work for Fightful. Um, I've had a few guys from Fightful, including Sean himself. His show's coming out on Wednesday. Um, like obviously Sean's helped me a lot with the podcast, and he gave me some advice about my son who's got ADHD. And he's been nothing but helpful to me. Every time I ask him a question, I've asked him several questions the last couple of days, and he just responds straight away. Even though he might not give me like a huge long message because he's busy, but he'll always reply. He'll always answer my questions. And him and Jimmy Van, they just seem like really good dudes. How did you end up sort of going to work with Fightful, and are they as cool as they seem?
they are very as cool as they seem. I can't say enough good things about Sean Ross Sapp. That guy was great to work for. I'd gladly work for him again if we ever crossed paths. But I think it was, I mean, it really, I think it was one of those things where I followed Sean on Twitter like ages ago, and we just sort of, I would check out his work, he would check out mine. And I remember when I was looking for outlets, I knew that he was, the managing editor of Fightful. So I just sent him a DM. Saying like, hey, if you guys are hiring, like, I'm looking to, do some more video interviews for some sites. And I had obviously a lot of content that I could show them because at that point I had done hundreds of interviews, video interviews. So that sort of was easier. And he's like, yeah, let me see what we can do. And Jimmy Van, actually, I should mention, this actually started before that. So I think when I was working in my day job, I think they had actually reached out to me. This was like maybe earlier that year about doing a podcast with Showdown Joe with them. And I couldn't because I think they wanted to record like in the morning or something. And I had my day job and it just didn't work out. And I think that there's an issue about me being exclusive to one of the freelance outlets I was working with. It was a long thing. But so I'd been in contact with them before, but I'd known Sean for years and everything. And then once this Fightful thing happened, I actually went out for lunch with Jimmy Van because I lived in Toronto at the time. And Jimmy Van also lives in Toronto. So I had, some drinks with them and we just sort of talked about what I could be doing for the site. And I sort of gave him some ideas and some things that I could do for the site. And it just sort of went from there. And, right from the get-go, they were great. They let me do as much content as I wanted. I think I was doing I think anywhere from like 25 interviews a month or something like that. But they were really good about it and really, gave me a good platform to post my content. And one of the cool things about it too that I think it helped them was, I'd try and tie in the wrestling stuff as much as I could. If I talk to a fighter, what do you think of pro wrestling? What do you think of this going on? Some fighters are huge pro wrestling fans, so it's sort of, deep dive into that. So it was a really good relationship. And then, like I said, when the score came around, one of the downsides, unfortunately, was that I had to give up all the outlets I was working for, give up my YouTube channel because they wanted to be exclusive because this is a full-time position. So yeah, I had to give it up, but I felt like this was the right move. I always like to move ahead, and so here we are. But yeah, nothing but good things to say about Sean and Jimmy over at Fightful. They were awesome.
Yeah, one of my actually, and I think you're right that when you came on board Fightful, I felt like the MMA channel, it was an MMA channel then on YouTube. I felt like that got a real big lift for when you came on board because you were doing obviously so many interviews, and your personality comes across very well in the interviews. Um, and I felt like they needed that because I think the podcast that they do with Showdown Joe and Sean, and then obviously you joined as well, is really good and it's really insightful. And I've always enjoyed it, but they didn't have as much content on the MMA side in terms of interviews and videos as they do on the wrestling side. And I felt like you say, your work certainly helped that. And one of my favorite aspects was what you just mentioned, where you used to ask the fighters about, about wrestling, or whether it was the current product, or what they watched as kids, or their favorite stars, growing up and stuff. And often their faces would light up because sometimes they may have been asked the same questions hundreds and hundreds of times over a couple of day period, particularly when they're doing media over a couple of days, and they would look happy to have a different question something not how's the camp going, how's this, how's that. So yeah, that was real cool. What was the what was the strangest response you ever got to, like, when you asked fighters about wrestling? Did any of them get like
Easily
a bit funny or?
the John Fitch interview I did earlier this year at Bellator 214. He told me that he used to try and cut off the dicks of his wrestling characters or something strange like that, like just a totally unexpected answer. And I remember Sean, like when I did the interview, he's like, "Oh, we're running with that headline," and I was like, "Yeah, that's fine by me." So I mean, I've got some fighters absolutely hate wrestling, some love it, like Curtis Millender, someone you wouldn't necessarily think would be a big pro wrestling fan. Like he had a WrestleMania viewing party at his place. Like that to me is cool. And I think that there's, for some reason, like you talked earlier about, boxing and MMA fans, like I find that wrestling and MMA fans are so like, like MMA fans are like, wrestling sucks, it's fake. And then wrestling fans say like, oh, MMA, so, this and that, I don't like it. Like, to me, I like all of it. I think it's great. I think if, there's some good, like wrestling, something, again, I keep a very like decent eye on, like kind of know what's going on. Not like I couldn't recite all the champions or anything like that, but I certainly keep an eye on what's going on. And I feel like working at Fightful sort of made me more interested in wrestling because I grew up a pro wrestling fan a bit, especially during the Attitude Era. So, for me, I like, getting to ask different stuff as well. That's always a challenge in an interview. So I was happy to sort of add that extra content when I would do my interviews.
Yeah, and I think, like I say, with a crossover site like Fightful is perfect, isn't it? When you can blend the two. And I think one of the funny you should say there about trying to find different questions to ask people. One of the things I've been conscious about is, obviously I've spoken to various different people, like ex-soccer players, doctors, journalists, people from Fightful, people from, podcasters and stuff. And I've tried to vary it up so I don't feel like I'm just asking the same questions to a different person. And it, I found, obviously I'm new to it, whereas, you've got a good bit of experience with interviewing people, but I found it can be quite tricky sometimes if you're speaking to, like I've spoken to a couple of people within sort of wrestling podcasting, and you sometimes it's difficult to ask different questions, if that makes sense.
No, it can be very difficult. And I had, because I was working for so many outlets, I mean, there were some days, I'm not kidding you, I would do like 17 video interviews like that's, just because like, just the way the schedule works out, or you can't get a certain fighter at a certain time. So imagine doing that many interviews in one day and then trying to come up with different stuff. Like it's, I usually what I'll do, and then this is a tip for anyone sort of out there, it's kind of common sense, but you wouldn't believe how many people forget to do this. But I'll go and check out their social media, their Instagram, their Twitter, whatever, and just try and find something that has some sort of interest outside of the regular how's training camp, how's, this and that, how's the weight cut, just to get something a bit different. So I find that that's something too, where, I try and go that extra mile and just get on their level. I mean, there's certain fighters that just aren't good interviews, but if you can get them on that level where you can talk about something that, they're interested in, then the interview usually goes a lot better. So it's just little things like that, just keep in mind.
So speaking of interviews then, what does any particular interview sort of spring to mind if I asked you, what was the craziest or most awkward or difficult interview you've ever had to do?
Well, craziest interview by far was I interviewed felony Charles Bennett, formerly known as Crazy Horse Charles Bennett. I mean, this guy, he couldn't stay focused. Like I'd ask him a question and then he'd go off on something else and he'd say really like, kind of obscene stuff, and you're trying to steer the interview. So, I mean, that by far is the most challenging interview I've done in terms of like trying to stay the course. And he was cool about it, but it just like I had to win his trust over by just sort of, going along with it. But I could see that being a nightmare for other people to do interviews. I've interviewed, like Hannah Cyphers, who's not very, outgoing. She's very shy. I'm sure you've seen that in some of her interviews. I've done like 4 interviews with her now, and I find that every time they're getting better. Like she's just someone who, like, you can tell has never been in front of a camera. So I sort of enjoy that challenge of trying to get the most out of someone. As far as like crazy ones, I had one that I don't know if it's still on my channel, but I had a fighter get mad at me like in the middle of an interview because of something some other fighter said in an interview that I did with them. So he tried to take it out on me, and he's like, "I can't believe how disrespectful you are." And I was like, "Whoa, like you didn't mention any of this before we did the interview." Like, and the guy just ended up looking bad as well. So I've had things like that. Yeah, and then like most memorable interview. I'm a huge Gegard Mousasi fan, so I got to interview him in person at UFC 210 in Buffalo, and it was awesome. He was just a a really good interview. In fact, I just interviewed him this past Friday again. Done a bunch since then, so he's always like top of the list interview. And I'm sure you're gonna ask me at some point, bucket list interview. I mean, I'd love to take the challenge of trying to interview Nick Diaz. He doesn't do many interviews. I'd love to just like try and get something with him. I've never had the pleasure of doing that, so that would be one for sure. But I've been very fortunate throughout my career to interview a lot of really great fighters and fighters that I wasn't sure if I'd ever get the chance to speak with. But I've been very lucky in that process to do that.
Yeah, some of them can be a bit prickly and a bit, they seem very inapproachable, some of them. And I mean, obviously, the thing which always interests me is, are they really like what they seem like, in the news and in their promos and things like that? When you speak to them, one-to-one in an interview, like people like the Diaz brothers, do they, how can I word it, give as little as
care the
F
least, yeah.
as they, I'm trying to say
some
without
do.
swearing.
I mean, I interviewed Robbie Lawler this year at UFC 135, the one in March, the Jones and Smith card. And I mean, he's a tough interview. I mean, I tried to get different stuff out of him, and it didn't work. And in fact, there's kind of a clip on YouTube. I don't know if someone had clipped it or not, but Lawler got mad at me during one of the media scrums because I asked him about a potential fight with Wonder Boy, and there was a report on BJ Penn that said that fight was being discussed, and Robbie for some reason was so offended when I mentioned that a potential fight with Wonder Boy. It's like he didn't, I don't know, for some reason it's like I told him something else. But so I mean, you're going to have stuff like that. I do so many interviews, you're bound to have things that are going to go wrong, and you push through it and you learn from it. And I mean, there's nothing I could have done differently in that situation. I mean, how was I supposed to know that he was going to be upset by that? So you got to see it all, and it just comes with experience. You got to do the reps and know how to handle situations.
Who's been the most surprising person you've interviewed in terms of when you've met them in person? Were they the same as what you thought they were going to be like?
I'm trying to think of someone like recently. Okay, like Edmund Shabazian, who fought at 235. He defeated Darren Stewart. From what I know, he doesn't like doing a lot of interviews, but I got a really good interview out of him recently. When I was there, like I kind of just tried to have fun with it, and we started talking about video games at the end, and he really lit up. And so that was one I was kind of unexpected. Trying to think of someone else recently where it's like I wasn't sure how they would be. Yeah, I don't know. I think I just try and make the best of every situation. I mean, you hear being media, we talk a lot. We know who's a good interview, who isn't. We know who's, like some fighters are just really bad at like showing up on time or things like that. So you sort of keep notes on that. But yeah, I'd say for the most part, I've had it pretty good when it comes to the fighters that I've had the chance to interview.
Cool. Have you ever interviewed Dana White?
I mean, I've had, I've asked him questions at press conferences. I've never had like a one-on-one with him. That's pretty tough these days with the media access and everything. But if you look on the UFC 238 press conference, I asked him about Vancouver, the UFC coming to Vancouver, and he said yes. So that was cool for me because I'm from Vancouver and I'm happy to go to that card. So yeah, I mean, technically I've spoken to him at press conferences a bunch of times.
Yeah, he always comes across a bit like 1 minute he seems really happy, and then the next minute he seems like really unapproachable. And I was just wondering if you'd ever had like a little sort of one-on-one with him, because it does interest me to know what he would be, what he is really like. Because obviously, what I see of him is the majority of the time he's hyping up fights or talking about fights. So I just wondered what he was like.
Yeah, no, I'd say you're right though. It's hit or miss. Or like for example, and I asked him this question about Vancouver. I usually ask him stuff about Canadian cards just because Canadian. I like to know these things, and a lot of times he'll just give me like a general answer, like, "Oh, we're working on it. We don't know." But for him to actually say yes, I was like, "That's cool." And then I got a lot of people messaging me about that because I do some commentary for a local promotion out here close to home called Rise FC. So I had a lot of people from there messaging me like, "Oh, thanks for asking that," because some of the fighters obviously want to compete in the UFC, and whenever they come to a certain city. Usually the local fighters are the ones that they'll sign. So it's always good to know.
Yeah. So I think anything when it comes to like your sort of your home city, you always want to see these big events and big companies come and put on a show. So that must have been, like you say, pretty cool to ask it and then find out that it was happening as well. Is a good result all around. So obviously I'm Welsh, British, Welsh. out of all, so I follow like a lot of the British fighters. Out of all sort of the UFC and Bellator, who do you think is the best sort of British or Irish fighter outside of Conor McGregor who would give us the best chance of having another champion?
Another champion. Oh, that's interesting. Where's Nathaniel Wood from? I think he's pretty talented. The bantamweight fighter for the UFC.
Yeah,
I think he's English, is he not? I
yeah,
could
I
be wrong
think
about
so.
that.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
think he is.
yeah, I think he's a talent. He's someone to keep an eye on. I really like this Fabian Edwards kid, Leon Edwards, his brother, who fights in Bellator. He's been quite the standout. I've been very impressed by him. Yeah, and I mean, like, I'm just trying to think of like up and comers or anything like that. It's certainly different. I mean, just like in Canada, I mean, there's fighters that come and go. Like, you guys had Bisping forever, and that was sort of the name, and Dan Hardy before that, and yeah, I think you're seeing now, sort of like a passing of the guard or changing the guard now. I think that. I think some of the promotions out there like Bama and Cage Warriors are doing a great job of really developing talent, and that's where you're seeing a lot of these fighters get into the UFC and they're seasoned, and they perform quite well. So it's good to see that scene is going quite strong. But yeah, if I had to pick one, I'll go Nathaniel Wood. I've been really impressed with him, and I think with how old he is and his candor and everything, I think he's got all the tools to be something special. And I know that division's super deep, but I think he'll do quite well.
I really like what's his name? Scottish guy. Gregor, is it Gregor Gillespie? I think his name. I forget.
Gregor Gillespie, yeah, he's American though. I'm almost positive.
Is he?
Yeah.
Is he? I thought he was like Scottish American, and maybe I'm wrong. I might be wrong with that. Probably.
Yeah, I'm just looking up here. I'm pretty sure, unless he was born there. No, he was born in the United States, but certainly a name that would sound British. Or
he
sounds
like Scottish, doesn't it? I like him. He entertains me. So obviously I'm Welsh, so like I follow Jack Marshman and Brett Johns. I really enjoy Brett Johns' fights. Actually, he's always good for a good back and forth. What do you think of those two guys? I mean, when Jack Marshman first came onto the scene, I thought he might have a chance of going somewhere because he had loads of power, and obviously he's a ex-soldier or soldier. He's still a soldier, isn't he?
Yeah. Remember you mentioned that in his last fight.
Yeah. I just don't know whether I don't think when he first came in, I was hopeful that he might sort of break into the sort of top 15, but he's taken a couple of losses since, and I'm not sure. Do you think he'll ever maybe get to that sort of top 15 level?
It's possible because middleweight's such a weird division right now. You have so many changes happening. You have fighters moving up. You have fighters, retiring. You have all types of things to go on. I think anything's possible. He's fighting Edmund Shabazian on that UFC 239 card, which I'm actually going to. So I mean, if he can get past Edmund, who's undefeated, that's a huge win for him, and that could really propel him up. So it's possible. And Brett Johns, I've been interviewing Brett since probably before he made his Titan FC debut. He's a great interview. He always makes time for me, and it's unfortunate what's happened to him in the last couple fights. I don't know what the latest is on him or when we're going to see him back, but one of the things I always like talking to him about is he does car racing, I think, is like one of his side hobbies. So I think that's cool too. He's a super nice guy, and I wish he had, he had a bit more success in the UFC. Hopefully, his next opponent will kind of propel him up that way. But I think two really great guys right there. As far as Johns, I believe. I mean, how old is he? He's probably under 30, I would think, or at least close to.
Yeah, I think he's sort of 27, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, 15-2 record, 27, and I mean, he lost to Sterling and Munoz, who just fought each other. So I mean, those are two really tough outings. I think he fights someone else, he get right back in the swing of things. Because that calf slicer when he had over Joe Soto, that was incredible, and he's fun to watch. So I think both those guys actually there could be some potential there.
Absolutely. So my friends who are MMA fans would not forgive me if I didn't ask you about Conor McGregor. I'm a huge fan of him. Obviously, he's been in the news for the wrong reasons a bit over the last couple of years. But you've interviewed Conor, haven't you?
I mean, I've been at events that he was at. I actually went to. I mean, I guess the only thing I've technically sort of said anything to was I was at the Mayweather McGregor press conference that they had in Toronto, and I think I asked him like one quick question because it was just a zoo with the amount of media there. Yeah. But I mean, I was at 196 when he lost to Nate Diaz. That was the first event I ever covered in Vegas. I was at 205 when he beat Alvarez for the title, which was historic. So yeah, I mean, I love watching Conor McGregor fight. I wish he'd fight more often. I get the political side of things where, obviously he wants big money fights, and I don't know who's going to fight next, but I don't think it's going to be Justin Gaethje, because I think if he comes back, it's only going to be for a big name. And as great as Gaethje is, he's not that type of name like a Cowboy Cerrone or Nate Diaz or someone like that. So yeah, I'm hoping he'll come back soon. And, we talked about the pay-per-view stuff with Brock Lesnar. Maybe that's another reason why we haven't seen him come in either. So we'll see. Hopefully they can figure something out, because you need Conor McGregor. I mean, he is a guy that they, it's just better when he's around in terms of what it does for the sport. But saying that, you got to be careful here. What happened to Ronda Rousey? When Ronda lost to Holly Holm, I know she was adamant about fighting for the title again, but they should have sat her down and said, look, you're not going to beat Amanda Nunes. We'll give you anyone else on the roster. Because here's the thing with Ronda, and I'll get back to McGregor in a second, but this is, I think it's important to mention. If Ronda fought anyone else in the bantamweight division other than Amanda Nunes, she wins, and she could have gone to WWE on a higher note, or she might have stayed in the UFC and still done quite well. But they literally gave her the best striker in the UFC in Amanda Nunes, and she tries to stand and trade with her, which is a terrible mistake. And she got knocked out. And that's unfortunately what people remember Ronda as, is she couldn't beat, some of the best. So I'm worried that the same thing could happen with McGregor here. If they give him Tony Ferguson, if they give him Poirier or whoever, if they do the Khabib rematch, it's not going to go well. They got to get Conor a win here. If you lose 2 straight fights, your stock goes down big time. Few fighters have been able to come out of that and still maintain their status, like a Chael Sonnen, who recently retired. But it's just, they got to get Conor a win here. And I think you got to give him a fight that's going to be competitive, which is why I thought the Diaz fight made sense, because Diaz had the layoff and he's coming in, and McGregor at least has fought a little bit more, and and he had already defeated him. So I think there's a way for him to win there, but we'll see what they decide. But they got to be careful with McGregor, because I think him losing 2 in a row would be really detrimental to his career.
Yeah, I agree. I think I always wonder, with the amount of money that he made from the Mayweather fight, whether once you've got so much money that you're never going to be able to spend it, I just wonder if it's harder to become motivated to get punched in the face over and over again every day and train. And, don't get me wrong, he's one of the most motivated fighters of all time in terms of, his background and where he came from, and, how he came up the ranks and things like that. But I just felt in the Khabib fight, I just felt a bit like he became so concerned with what Khabib was doing that he didn't do all the things that had got him to the dance. He was quite heavy on his feet, and he wasn't quick and snappy with his counter-punching. He was a bit sluggish. So you didn't see the Conor of perhaps 2-3 years earlier, when he faced Aldo or Diaz, where he was just looked quick and sharp. And I really one day hope that it's possible that we get that rematch and Conor can, fight at his peak and how he can fight. Don't get me wrong, Khabib's a machine, and he might still, grapple him to the ground and just pummel him. But I do feel like Conor wasn't at his best that night.
I agree with that. I think that the glaring hole in his takedown defense, which is something we saw against Chad Mendes as well when they fought, is something that can't be ignored. And I think if they do have that rematch, they got to do it. They got to give it some time, and Conor's got to get some more cage time in there, because I don't know. Everyone has a different version of what they saw with the Khabib and Conor fight. I was actually at that fight as well, and to me, it was a one-sided fight. I mean, Khabib, he knocked McGregor down. He basically had his way with him, and then he ended up submitting him late in the fight. But I don't feel comfortable doing that rematch now with what's at stake with Conor. I think you got to give him a bit of a layup here for his next fight, or something that's going to be more competitive, and then get him towards doing that rematch with Khabib. And that's not, and saying that as well, I mean, you can't count out Dustin Poirier against Khabib either. So that's a fight that they could do, the rematch, because McGregor obviously has a win over Poirier at 45.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I thought the Cerrone fight for McGregor was a good fight. It was still a fight he could lose, but I just felt that it felt like the right fight for him. Rather than putting him in there with Ferguson or, like you say, Khabib. I just felt that was the right one. But again, Diaz would have been a good one. Or even, I think, Poirier is another one I'd keep him away from. Yeah. So just to sort of finish off then, how did you feel about the Cerrone stoppage against Ferguson? because you could tell as soon as he blew his nose, you could almost see his face sort of drop as he realised what he'd done. And obviously he blew his nose and his eye just went closed. And I know, as you do, people on social media were moaning that it was a bad way to finish a great fight. But obviously, the doctors had to stop it. They couldn't let him go in with an eye like that. Do you agree?
I do agree. And any fan that says that Donald Cerrone quit in that fight, just hand in your fan badge right now. Like, come on. Donald Cerrone, absolutely, of all people, is trying to get out of a fight. Like, give me a break. Like, it happens. This is what I think happened. I think he was uncomfortable in his nose. He blew it, and he didn't realize that was going to puff up, because that happened to Eddie Alvarez. I forget which fight it was. It was either Melendez or Pettis. I can't remember. But he had the similar thing happen, and he was able to just, get through it, and it didn't completely close his eye. But for Cerrone, yeah, I mean, obviously he wasn't winning, but come on, seeing this guy's quitting, like, give me a break. Like, this is the guy who fights 5 times a year. This guy's not quitting. He's not afraid of anything. It's ridiculous to think otherwise. So yeah. And I mean, as far as the stoppage, it was the right call. He couldn't see out of his eye. That's why you have the doctors there. I was totally fine with that. And I don't think it took away from Ferguson's victory, because I thought he was winning pretty clearly going into that.
Yeah, he was. It was not close in terms of scores and things, was it? I feel really bad for Tony Ferguson, because he should have had a title shot a way long time ago, and now obviously Poirier looks. Is that been confirmed? Poirier and Khabib, or is it
they have confirmed that fight? Yeah. So because remember, they had the press conference last week. So that fight is going to happen in Abu Dhabi. Great matchup. Sucks it's in Abu Dhabi, because I don't think I'll be able to go cover that one. It's going to be a little pricey to go down there. But yeah, I mean, certainly I can't wait for that fight. That's because honestly, with what Poirier did to Holloway, I think now. I think he has a chance to beat Khabib. I mean, I really think that he has the tools to do, things that other fighters couldn't. And Khabib's obviously undefeated as well. So I'm really excited for that fight. That could be the fight of the year right there.
Oh yeah, I was surprised though. I thought the way as impressive as Holloway had been over the last couple of years, I shouldn't have been, but I was genuinely surprised when he lost. Even though Poirier's been on a tear and he's very, very, very talented. Holloway had been so impressive for so long that you almost just expected him to, just to do what he'd been doing.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how much better Poirier's got. It's tough. Max has fought nothing but killers, and he was bound to lose at all the greats lose. I mean, Demetrius Johnson lost. I mean, you have fighters that. It's tough to maintain. That's the toughest part, is maintaining that winning streak. And, I think Dustin was the better fighter, but I think they could fight 9 out of 10 times and you might get 9 different results, because they're just it's such a game of inches. And I really feel like, Holloway is still incredibly talented. And, I think, it's just they're so like evenly matched is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. What weight did Conor fight Poirier at?
145.
See, I would like to see that rematch now, but not yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well,
I would like to see it, but just not yet.
Yeah, I was going to say, someone was mentioning that today because it's a fresh matchup. Actually, Brian Kelleher, when I was doing the podcast this morning, he was my guest co-host, and he suggested that fight, if Poirier beats Khabib, then it's a rematch that Conor had won the first fight, so people could use that as a potential for him to get it. That's the other thing we haven't talked about either, is that, like, does Conor want to fight in a non-title fight? He hasn't in such a long time. Like, is that the goal? Like is he going to be very adamant about that? Like, I'm not fighting unless it's for a title, even with his loss. Like, he has that type of power. So if Poirier wins, that's a fight that could potentially happen. So we'll have to see. But again, I don't think Conor should take that fight. He should take an easier fight. A fight that he has a chance of winning, because I don't know if he beats Poirier in the rematch. I really don't.
It's a big risk, isn't it? And it's a risk he doesn't need to take, because he can pick his fight,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you, James, so much for joining me. I really appreciate you finding the time to speak to me. Tell the people where they can find you on Twitter and YouTube.
Just follow me on Twitter at Lynch on Sports. That's LYNCH. And just look up on YouTube the Score MMA, all one word. You'll find all our videos. I think we're up to almost 100 videos now. We just passed 1,000 subscribers. So if you guys could subscribe, that's where you'll find all of my original video interviews. One of the things I really wanted to do when I took over this position was create original content. A lot of the sites, not going to throw any shade on any of them, but a lot of them just repeat the same stuff that everyone else says, and they sort of take the lead of what happens on some of the bigger sites. But for me, I wanted to focus a lot on original content. We'll cover the major news, but we also want to create our own stuff as well. I got some cool interviews coming out this week. Like I said, interviewed Gegard Mousasi, interviewed Todd Duffy, who hasn't fought since July of 2015. Really cool stuff with him. So things like that is what you can expect on the channel. And anywhere in the world, doesn't matter where you are, download the Score app on your phone. If you want to get the latest updates on soccer or hockey or football or whatever, it's a great app, and it's the second largest sports app in North America. So definitely check that out, and you'll get notifications on when all my content is up there. So thanks so much for having me, man. I appreciate the time.
No problem at all. And I am going to download that app when we finish.
There you go.
So, guys, leave us a thumbs up on the video. If you could give us a subscribe, that'd be great. And give it a share. Tell your friends. Tell all your friends, all your family. Tell them to come and take a look at our podcasts. We got shows with all sorts of people on all sorts of subjects. And we just like to hear people's stories, talk to them. And that's it, really. We'll see you. I'll see you next time. You can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date on upcoming content and guests. It's at ACEcast_nation, and find us on Facebook at ACEcast Nation. And all our shows are available on our YouTube channel, but also audio versions available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, and more. Get involved by leaving us a comment. And we'll see you next time. Thank you again, James. And thank you, everyone, for watching.
Shut up and sit down.
What's up, you guys? Sean Ross Sapp of Fightful. You're checking out the Ace Nation podcast.